right, shalom, Shabbat shalom. So let's turn to Hebrews, Ivrim, chapter 9. Chapter 9. This week we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 6. We're going to be looking at the earthly sanctuary. The earthly sanctuary. And my goodness, do translation problems abound in those first few verses. We've got golden censers, or is it golden altars? Do we have incense candles? I mean, the translation problems abound. Then we go on to verses 6 through 10. We'll be looking into the limitations of the earthly service. They were a symbol. It even says that the earthly tabernacle was a parable. A parable. Many people like to skip over that one. Then through verses 11 to 15, we'll be looking into the heavenly sanctuary, where there's a cleansing of our conscience, as opposed to the limited earthly sanctuary that was a cleansing of the carnal flesh. Then in verses 16 through 23, we'll be looking at the death of the mediator. And this is one of the most mistranslated and misunderstood passages in the New Testament, which can only be reconciled in light of understanding the big Melchizedek picture. That Yahuwah made a unconditional sworn oath covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12. But Abraham went away and he came back in a lack of faith, and he asked Yahuwah, how will I know that I will really inherit the promise that you have sworn to me? So Yahuwah then gives a conditional covenant arm to that covenant, which is Genesis 15, with the flaying open of the animals. This is a conditional arm to that covenant, meaning if somebody breaks this covenant, then there's going to be a death that is required. And you're going to see all of this spoken about in Hebrews chapter 9. Then we fast forward 430 years later as they are delivered out of Egypt, that they come to the mountain in Exodus 19 and Exodus 24 with the blood ratification of the book of the covenant and the covenant confirming meal. All of this is referenced in Hebrews chapter 9. That if you don't understand the context of what's going on, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Exodus 19 through 24:12, and then the covenant is confirmed and the people say, yes, Yahuwah, all that you have said we will do. And then within 40 short days, they are whoring and they break the covenant at the golden calf, Exodus 32. And Yahuwah then, because the covenant, the book of the covenant is broken, he imposes the book of the law, the Levitical hierarchy, the whole tabernacle system, which was never intended to be on earth. Because of their disobedience, they are now put under a mediator until the time of Reformation, when somebody would come who would be perfect, without sin, and would pay the death penalty position of Genesis 15, that would then allow all of Yahuwah's people to no longer be a kingdom with a priest, but going back to the Exodus 19 perfect will. You would all be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests, the reunification of the Melchizedek priesthood under the high priest in the new covenant. This is what Hebrews 9 is all about. Yet, the stumbling block, the hardest verses to understand, chapter 9, verse 16 and 17, we will see that people for millennia have stumbled over this verse. Is it a testament? Is it a will? Are we talking about testators? Whatever that means. It says, yes, it's abounds, they abound. Then we'll look, of course, in verses 16 through 23 at this in depth. Then there'll be apparently things inserted, some would accuse the author of, inserting things in the narrative in Hebrews chapter 9, 16 through 23, that aren't even there in Exodus 19 and 24. Well, all of a sudden there's goats, and then there's the book that's being sprinkled, and hyssop, and blood, and oil, and you go back into the Torah, and you're like, I don't see this, what's going on? And then some with a knee-jerk reaction can't reconcile it with their Jewish paradigm, so they throw the book of Hebrews out. And all of this we've witnessed over the past decade or so as people, even in the Messianic and Hebrew roots movement, continue to stumble and stumble because they can't see the paradigm of the Melchizedek realm. Genesis 12, 15, Exodus 19 through 24:12, and what we're talking about today. So then finally in verses 23, all the way up till the end of the chapter, we will look at the greatness of Mashiach's sacrifice, which was before the foundation of the world. You'll miss the whole point. You'll miss the whole point if you don't realize that it's always been about the heavenly lamb, not the heavenly ham, as many of us learn in the institutionalized church. So, let's look at chapter 9 and verse 1. Then truly, the first, now this is the Greek word that we will be looking to see if it is in the text or if it is not in the text. It is the Greek word diatheke, and it means covenant. Now, oftentimes, you'll see covenant in your text, and it's not there, because the Greek word diatheke is absent, but translators just decide to stick it in there for you. Now, the New King James will at least be decent enough to italicize covenant to show you that they're lying and it's not actually there. But many of the modern translations, like the NIV, they just write it on in and don't even give you the decency to know that it's not in the text. So this Greek word, diatheke, which comes from chadashah, meaning covenant in the Hebrew, we find in verse 1. Then truly the first diatheke, it is absent in verse 1. It's not there. It's not there. So many of the translations will have covenant right there in verse 1. Give me a show of hands if your translation has covenant. It's not there. Show me in your translation, show of hands, if it's at least in italics. Okay, so we've got some with the italics. What are they? The King Jimmy, King James, New King James, they italicize it. Then truly the first, that's all it says, the first also had regulations of worship. So now we have to look at the context and we have to go, what are we talking about? Are we talking about covenant? Are we talking about priesthood? Are we talking about tabernacle? And in the context here, it's priesthood. Then truly, the first priesthood also had regulations of worship and an earthly kadosh, holy place. For there was a tent of meeting made, the first area where the menorah, the shulchan, and the lechem, the table of showbread, of the Shekinah, the glory was, which is called the Makom Kadosh. And after the second veil, the area of the tent of meeting, which is called the Kedosh HaKedoshim, the Holy of Holies, which had, and this is where the translation errors abound. We've got golden altar, we've got incense, candle, and many other translations. And if you go back to the Torah, it doesn't jive, and people struggle. One of the popular translations will have right here, altar of incense. Show me if your translation, by a raising of hands, has altar of incense. Altar of incense is not in the text. It's not in the text. Yet, it finds itself into many of the modern translations. Now, this addition of altar of incense or golden altar of incense has caused huge confusion. Huge confusion, even in the Hebrew roots and the Messianic movement. Huge confusion because people just go back to the Masoretic text and they just can't reconcile this apparent contradiction. But if we just slow things down and we dig a little bit deeper than just scratching the surface, we'll find that everything becomes harmonious. So, golden altar of incense or altar of incense, it isn't in the text at all. So we have to get out of this Masoretic or Jewish mindset that we just go back to what the rabbis say or what the Masoretes inscribe to check. We have to go a little bit deeper. Because what you'll find is it was, in fact, the golden censer, which is or should be in the text right here. And you may say, well, you know, you're really splitting hairs. No, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Because what you'll find is if you go back to the Torah, there is no altar of incense or golden altar of incense that would be in this position. But if you go back to the Torah, you will find that the golden censer was brought from the holy place, Exodus 30, verse 1, into the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur, Leviticus 16:12. And this is what our author is addressing. But if we miss that, then people get into all kinds of paranoid delusions about the New Testament not matching up with the Torah, when in fact it does. It's a translation problem. So what should be here in the text is the golden censer that was rolled into the Holy of Holies once a year, Vayikra, Leviticus 16:12, once a year. That's what our author is speaking about, because ultimately he's telling us that Yahusha's priesthood is greater in that it gives us what? It gives us unrestricted access. We don't have to wait once a year to be rolled right on in there. We have unrestricted access. That's his point. That's the purpose of this narrative of this chapter, and many people miss that right off the back. And if you're stumbling right here in the fourth verse, then what are you going to do when you get to the 16th and the 17th verses? You're going to be tripping all over yourself. And that's what happens. And that I've been witness to it over the past 20 years. I left the institutionalized church based upon the book of Hebrews, and then I left the Messianic movement based upon the book of Hebrews, because people continue to either dress Judaism up in a lamb, the Messianic and Hebrew roots movement, and they've done a good job of it, but literally it's just dressing Judaism up in a lamb, and I don't buy it. But I'm also not going to go with the institutionalized lawlessness that abounds either. So you end up in this very, very narrow road, which is called Royal Covenant Torah through the Melchizedek high priest, Yahusha. And it always comes down to this question: who's your high priest? How you answer that will affect how you understand the Torah. You'll either dress the Torah up in a lamb, and it's really Judaism dressed up in a lamb, or you'll understand it as a new covenant Torah, Jeremiah 31:31, and it's royal, it's kingly, and you are a royal priesthood. It's amazing stuff. So the author is addressing right here in the fourth verse, Yahusha's priesthood is greater in that it gives us unrestricted access to the Father's mercy, unlike the Levitical priesthood that gave the high priest once a year limited access to the mercy seat. Now, to solidify that understanding in verse 4, you would find the Hebrew word mizbech, which would be golden altar of incense. It isn't in the text. It isn't in the text. What you do find is machtar, meaning fire holder, censer, or snuff dish, and that was rendered in the Septuagint as thumiateron, and that is the actual term that does appear right here in chapter 9. Verse 4 is the Greek word thumiateron, which is translated from the Hebrew word machtar, which means the fire holder, the censer of or snuff dish that you would find. That censer lines up perfectly with the Torah. It really does make a lot of sense when you just start to slow it down. Now we can continue on in verse 4, which had the golden censer and the ark of the testimony covered on all sides with gold, in which was the golden pot that had manna. Now many people will even take issue with this. Well, hang on a minute. In Exodus 16, verse 33, there's no golden pot of manna in the Masoretic text. But the Septuagint in Exodus 16, verse 33 tells you that there was a golden pot of manna. So it really depends upon how you approach Hebrews. If you're approaching Hebrews with wanting to get rid of it and just sticking with a Masoretic interpretation, then you really are going to run into a bunch of trouble. But when you start to step back and go, hang on a minute, we need to look into the Septuagint. We need to go back to the Hebrew that was actually in use at the time of Yahusha, that was then translated into the Septuagint. Then everything jives and it's perfect. You don't even need to make sense of Hebrew. You don't even need to check the Aramaic, because the Septuagint clears it all up 100%. 100%. So now we go into verse 4 and we see this golden pot, Septuagint, Exodus 16, verse 33, that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the testimony, and over it the cherubim of glory, shadowing the mercy seats, of which we won't now speak in detail. Why won't we speak in detail about it? Because it's spoken about in detail already in Shemot, Exodus chapter 25. You can go back and read it yourself. Now, verse 6. Now, when these things were prepared, the Kohanim, the priests, went always into the Makam Kadosh, the holy place of the tent of meeting, performing the services. But into the Kadosh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, went the Kohen Hagadol, high priest, alone once every year, with dam, with blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people. And this is the major distinction. This is the major distinction. Sinful man has to offer sacrifice for his own sins before he can even address the nation. He's bumbling around in there, dealing with all of his own sins, and the audience knew just how sinful the priesthood was. Ever since the Hasmonean dynasty, they were whoremongers that were buying and selling the priesthood. I expect they spent quite a long time trying to cleanse from their own sins while the people were desperately needing help. And they didn't get the help. So basically, the people were loaded down with sins, is what the author has communicated. In a desperate, tense time, when the Roman armies are riding on Jerusalem, there's zealot action, and the people are aware of their sins, and they are under threat of death by day, yet they are loaded down with sins, and they could die at any moment, and they've not got no address, no recourse. They are loaded with the burden, and if they die, they don't know where they're going, because guess what? They've got no covering. You and I, if we see that death is before us, we can immediately repent have full access through the mediator, and our sins are taken care of. That is a hope. That is an assurance that our author's audience did not understand that he was really trying to drive home. Do you see the point here? I mean, we can skim over this, but no. They're like, well, hang on a minute. The Levitical regime, they're so simple. They're going to be in there for a week before I might not even be alive by the time they're ready to see me. It's like trying to go to the Catholic confession. Well, they're dealing with all their child molestation, excuse me. They're not going to have time for me. They got a whole bunch to clean up, right? Gee, let's look at verse 8. The Ruach HaKodesh, therefore, signifying that the way into the Makom Kadosh, holy place, was not yet made manifest for believers while the first tent of meeting was still standing. Let's skip over the next verse because we don't want to pay any attention to that. It was a bloody parable, for crying out loud. Can we be honest? You mean everything from Exodus 24:12, including Exodus 25 and the whole tabernacle, its purpose was a parable. It was a story because they didn't understand the reality in the heavens. So should we be spending our time on a parable, or should we be trying to grasp hold of the reality in Yahusha? That's the things that I don't understand. Why are we trying to lead people down the parable road when in reality we should be leading people down the supernatural kingdom reality here today road? It was a parable. That was all it ever was. A parable. Why do so many teachers skip this very step, this very verse? I don't understand. The tabernacle was a parable for the time then present in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make the one that did the service perfect regarding his conscience. They knew. They went through all of that rote, but their conscience still convicted them. Because you're killing animals that never volunteered to be slain. It wasn't their choice. They didn't surrender. They were drugged, kicking and screaming to be... Your conscience, you know that your conscience would still be troubling you. Unlike the mediator, Yahusha, who went willingly to be slain. Thus purifying the conscience is what the author is talking about. Which stood, verse 10, only in food offerings and drink offerings and different washings and carnal ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So the book of the law, which had all the carnal ordinances, was imposed upon Israel until the time of Reformation, when the Messiah would come, pay the death penalty position of Genesis 15, and then allow Israel to connect back to the covenants of promise, Ephesians 2:12, which are solidified in the oath covenant of Genesis 12. This is perfect will, and this is what the author is trying to communicate. Now, I do believe I did get into a squabble with a pastor once back in the institutionalized church over verse 10. Because there's not two things that are mentioned here, but there's actually three things. It's very convenient to pick out the two and say, well, see, now look, you shouldn't be doing the dietary requirements. There's one. And you shouldn't be getting involved in all of this law stuff. And then if I actually look at it, I go, well, there's actually three things that are mentioned here in verse 10, not two, three, and they are all connected together. So we have to be consistent with our biblical hermeneutics. That's a big word for us, isn't it? Not a convenient two that the institutionalized church has twisted to mean dietary laws. Let's look at the three that are intricately connected here. In the Greek, we have number one, bromasin kai, food offerings, bromasin kai. Number two, pomasin kai, we have drink offerings. And then thirdly, we have diaphoris baptismos, those what? Different washings. They're all connected together. You can't simply pluck out the dietary requirements from verse 10 and ceremonial washings of the Torah and say, well, see, these are irrelevant to the faith, which many of us have come across, haven't we? But that's not what it's talking about. Because then they would conveniently overlook drink, right? Conveniently overlooking drink. The Levitical priesthood and its regulations is the context of verse 10. Food, drink, and various washings. This has got nothing to do with the dietary requirements. This has got nothing to do with getting rid of the Torah. But it is talking about the Levitical order, the ministrations that were connected to the Levitical order. You can't rip out food and go off on kosher dietary laws having nothing to do with the faith. And this is the little squabbles that I've got into over the past decade or so with people. I'm like, well, no, that's not what it's talking about. The context here is totally different. We're talking about the Levites being able to partake of the animal sacrifices where the priests had to wash before they were allowed to eat the meat of the guilt offerings offered before Yahuwah. And you can cross-reference this with Deuteronomy 18, verse 1. You can't rip out two to make a case out of the three against kosher eating and keeping the Torah. But so many pastors do focus on the two, but really there's three that are intricately connected together. You cannot leave out drink. Now, the second area our author lists is drink. And this isn't connected to the dietary commandments either, but of course the priesthood. There's nothing in the Torah prohibiting alcohol except to the priests in their service, Leviticus 10:8, and the Nazarite, Numbers chapter 6. And then thirdly, our author lists the various washings. And basically, what this is talking about is Yahusha offers a far deeper cleansing than just the ceremonial or the physical level of washing. Let's look at verse 11. But Mashiach has now become a Kohen Hagadol, a high priest of Tov, good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tent of meeting, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, neither by the dam, the blood of goats and of calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the Kadosh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a red heifer and the sprinkling of the defiled sets apart the flesh, how much more, the question is raised, shall the dam, the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Ruach offered himself without blemish to Eloah, purify your conscience from dead works to serve the living Eloah. So verses 15 through 18 are one of the most misunderstood passages in the whole of the Brit Hadashah. What with covenant sometimes being in the text and then at other times not being in the text, we can see right here as we've broken it down so far that it's the translations that truly are causing the stumbling blocks. Can you see that so far? So it's worth it to me to take the time to go through this with you so that you can make those notes in your scriptures, and then you can then go out and help and teach others that may also be stumbling around as well. these misunderstood passages. What we find is this Greek word diatheke, which is covenant. Sometimes it's translated. Sometimes it's inserted into the text without cause. Sometimes it's in italics. Then sometimes it's even replaced with will, testament, and various other writings. And it does get people extremely confused. The author right now, we're going to find, as we look into verse 15, he's using a midrashic wordplay on the Greek word diatheke, which means covenant. Blood spilled. Blood was spilled. A death happened for both will and testament in relation to what? He's speaking about all of this in relation to Genesis 15. If you don't understand that verses 15 through 18 are speaking about Genesis 15, then you're going to end up extremely confused. Because he's going to do this midrashic wordplay using the Greek word diatheke or covenant, which is now going to be this wordplay about the death, the covenant. And this is what he's going to be now speaking on in relationship to Genesis 15, the blood covenant and death penalty position that the children of Israel confirmed 430 years later with the sprinkling of the blood and the book of the covenant. Now, let's have a look and at some translations that we have in the congregation. So, first of all, tell me what translation that you're using, and then read to me those verses.
Okay, I'm reading from the American Standard Version.
Okay.
16. For where a testament is, there must of necessity be the death of him that made it. For a testament is of force where there hath been death. For it doth never avail while he that made it liveth.
Okay, and back up and give me verses 15, 16, and 17 from the top. Let's try that.
15. And for this cause he is the mediator of a new covenant, that a death having taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first covenant, they that have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. 16. And for where a testament is, there must of necessity be the death of him that made it. And for a testament is of force where there hath been death, for it doth never avail while he that made it liveth.
And tell me that version again.
American Standard.
American Standard. Second. Who's second?
So I'm reading from the Scriptures.
The Scriptures. Give me verses 15 through 17.
And because of this, he is the mediator of a renewed covenant, so that, death having taken place for redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, those who are called might receive the promise of the everlasting inheritance. For where a covenant is, it is necessary for the death of the covenanted one to be established. For a covenant over those dead is firm, since it is never valid when the covenanted one is living.
Okay. And third?
I'm reading from the Sacred Name version. And for this purpose, he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death for the redemption of transgressions of the First Testament, those which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must also of necessity be the death of that which ratifies. For a covenant is made firm over the death of the victim. Otherwise, it is of no strength at all while that which ratifies is alive.
All right. And fourth?
The Aramaic English New Testament. And for this reason he became the mediator of the renewed covenant, that he might by his death be redemption to them who had transgressed the first covenant, so that they who are called to the eternal inheritance might receive the promise. For where there is a testament, it indicates the death of him who made it, for it is valid only of a deceased person, because it has no use so long as the maker of it lives.
And sixth, so you can see already, some of you are starting to get bog-eyed or bug-eyed or whatever. But you can really see how people, it's like, now what? What? What are we talking about? Are we talking about testaments, wills, covenants, testators, will makers, death? And the translations abound. There are so many different ones. But with us, having spent this time going through the Melchizedek realm, if we understand, some people don't even connect this to Genesis 15. If you can't connect this to Genesis 15, you are awash in an ocean of doctrine. Because then you're going to start going to commentaries from church fathers, the institutionalized church, or rabbis, and they're not going to be talking about Yeshua as the high priest. They're not going to be talking about that he paid the death penalty position of Genesis 15. So without locking this in to Genesis 12, 15, Exodus 19 through 24:12, we are awash in an ocean of doctrine. And that is the problem. We have got the institutionalized church that is awash in an ocean of doctrine of lawlessness and pagan syncretism. And we then have the Judaism that is awash in an ocean of rabbinical tradition and rabbinical oral law. And now, in the past 30 years, we've got Messianic and Hebrew roots, which literally has done a phenomenal job at dressing Judaism up as a lamb, which then just blends everything, and it causes even more confusion because it's not acknowledging the high priesthood of Yahusha. Because unless you have the courage to stand up and say, we serve a Yahuwah of distinctions, which means that he has a Torah of distinctions, unless you are willing to say that we are looking at a Torah of distinctions, you will not be able to have a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Because a Torah without distinctions does not allow Yahusha to be the high priest. So you cannot say out of one side of your mouth, Torah, 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 and then out of the other side of your mouth say, oh yes, but Yahusha is my high priest. No, you don't have that option. Unless you rightly divide the Torah and you understand that we serve an Elohim of distinctions and that he has already built in the change in law, Genesis 49:10, was already there, that you must transfer within the Torah to the higher realm, which is Royal Covenant, Book of the Covenant Torah. But if there is no distinction between Book of the Law and Book of the Covenant, then you have Judaism dressed up as a lamb. And you are leading people to the slaughter. Because you've got enough of Mashiach in there to lead them astray. But ultimately, they will choose the wrong way. It's a deception. It's a deception. I know because I was heavily, heavily involved in it. In fact, I got a call this week from Australia from another rabbi that I used to be associated with when I was entrenched in the zealotry and radicalism of the Messianic movement. And his journey and his testimony was amazing to me. And we spent some time repenting and confessing, and he's come out the whole way as well, and has now been listening and studying on the Melchizedek priesthood, and is so excited. And it's ultimately about the grace of Yahusha empowers you to keep royal covenant Torah. But we are in the business of looking for souls, not measuring how long your seats are. We need to be concerned about the souls of the people and then lead them into the holy commandment requirements for a holy, distinct life. And that is amazing, because this brother was with me in the thick of radical messianicism. Radical stuff. So I've been all the way in. I didn't just put a foot in. I went, and there was like, we weren't invited to conferences because we were too serious about the Torah. And the reality is, I love the Freudian slips that you hear, because that gives a lot away about a person. And the reality is, I've heard a lot of these Freudian slips. Many in the Hebrew roots and Messianic movement are worshiping the Torah. They are not worshiping Yahusha as the high priest. What do you mean, worship Yahusha? Look in the New Testament. How many times did the Talmudim worship? How many times? Deal with those texts and then come and take me to task. You see, because ultimately we have to understand that Yahuwah sent his Son from his bosom to do the work of the high priesthood, to bring us all in to this kingdom realm that we're now experiencing. And it's amazing. It's amazing. So now, strip away all the translations and let's take the grammar out of verses 15, 16, and 17. We'll strip away all of the grammar that's been inserted by the translators and just go with the Greek, no grammar added, okay? And let's see what we've got. Keeping it simple. Keeping it simple. Bear in mind, we are talking about somebody has to die and pay the death penalty position of Genesis 15 so that we can now connect back to the oath-swearing promise of Genesis 12 and become a nation and kingdom of priests that is now brought into all of the Book of the Covenant Torah blessings, without the added carnal commandments of the book of the law, which was a consequence of the golden calf. Because we're not talking the sons of Aaron here, we're talking the sons of Melchizedek. And because of this, of a new covenant, yes, the Greek word diatheke is in fact in the text here, so we'll use it. And because of this, of a new covenant, diatheke, he is mediator. Death having come for redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. Diatheke, the transgressions that happened where? Exodus 32, because of that book of the covenant unfaithfulness. Those called may receive the promise of the age during inheritance. We're talking Ephesians 2:12, the promise of Genesis 12 we need to connect back to. Verse 16, for where a covenant, diatheke, now the covenant we're talking about is what? The covenant of Genesis 15, diatheke, for where a covenant is, the death of the covenant victim to come is in a necessity. Diathemene, meaning someone has to die if Genesis 15 is broken, i.e. the flaying open of the pieces. For what we find, the making of this covenant, the Greek word is used. This Greek word is used for the making of this covenant, and it's the Greek word pheres. And it's used. It means to carry a burden, meaning this, that the covenant one, the one who made the covenant, would have to carry the burden. Now look at the connections of this Greek word, because it's very telling. It shows up in in Mark 15, verse 22. Then they brought, the Greek word there, pheres, they brought him to the place of Golgotha. What was he doing? He was carrying the burden when he came to Golgotha. It's the same Greek word that is used in verse 16. about the one that's going to have to die because he carries the burden of breaking the covenant. But it also appears in Luke 23, verse 26. When they led him away, they seized him. A man, Shimon the Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the beam to carry. The Greek word there is pharaoh, and he had to carry the burden. He carried the burden. So Yahusha bears the burden and carries the punishment for those who violated the book of the covenant. We cannot follow Judaism dressed up as a lamb any longer. We cannot. I'm not buying it. Neither is my friend who's a former rabbi in Australia buying it. We were fully entrenched zealots. We'd seen the inside out. We weren't just doing it, for conference speaking fees, because nobody would have the zealots come, because we'd mess up everything by giving you a literal interpretation of, yes, you better start doing animal sacrifices then. Yes, you better start having multiple wives then. That's how we were. Because it's right there in the Torah. Let's not be lightweight about it. Oh, well, you can't say, are you doing Torah? Then let's do it. Don't double talk me. Oh, you can't have those guys come in. They really believe in the Torah. Oh, no, you don't want those guys coming. No. See, no, I know. I've been down that road, fully in or fully out. And now I'm fully into the Melchizedek Yahusha, because I realize that my intellect, my logic, it failed me. All of those years of study, all of that knowledge, it failed me. When I had tragedy in my life, it was my faith that sustained me. The same faith that I had when I was 24 years old. But now I can take everything that I've learned and apply it to that faith to help people grow their faith as I grow my faith. That's what it's about. You see? So sometimes Yahuwah takes zealots, throws them in the thick of things to cause a fire and spark, so that then he can pull them out and they can experience it and then say, don't make the mistakes that I've made, and don't follow the double talk hypocrisy when they say out of one side of the mouth they're doing Torah, but and out of the other side of the mouth they can't reconcile that Yahusha is the high priest. And if you're really doing Torah, then it's Shabbat today. How many lambs did you sacrifice? There's no excuse in the Torah for not doing it. Okay? There is no excuse in the Torah, no verse that says that you have the right to delay and build a temple because the Jews aren't ready yet. So either get on board or get on board with what's being taught about the distinction between the book of the law and the book of the covenant. Because otherwise you're doing nothing different than you did in the institutionalized church, which is picking and choosing which Torah commandments apply today. It's the same thing as you did in the institutionalized church, and you need to get healing and deliverance from that kind of theology. And what I say, just like I said when I was in the Torah, that's why I was a zealot, because I wasn't institutionalized. Because I was a heathen for my life, and then I got born again. I've always been radical. Radically into drugs, radically into lewdness, and then I got saved, and I was radically saved and radically on fire. And I still am. Because that's what I am. I'm hot, and I run hot, and it is hot. And I'm bloody hot in here. But I'm telling you, so even when I was like Torah, yes, we don't want the lawlessness of the church. That's true. It's Torah. Then I'm all in. We're not picking and choosing. Or we can't have this guy come and talk to the conference. He's going to start talking about multiple wives and slaying animals because he's into the Torah. We do Judaism dressed up as a lamb. But then I saw the error of that. So I'm like, no, it's still all in. But it is royal covenant Torah. We do everything, Genesis 1:1 all the way through to Exodus 24:12. Everything. We don't pick and choose. Everything. We do the Feast of Yahweh. We do the dietary requirements. We do the Shabbat. We do holy, righteous living. And we are under the order of Melchizedek. We do not practice the Levitical hierarchy because you either do all of it and Aaron's your high priest, or you do none of it and you acknowledge the transference that's in the Torah and Yahusha's your high priest. Who's your daddy? That's what it comes down to. It's true. Who's your daddy? And then they slip out of their mind that they do the Freudian slip that they're worshiping the Torah. And it comes out and you go, ha, exactly, that's what it is. That's the truth. That's the truth. Calm down. I haven't even got to verse 17. Verse 17. For a covenant, and the Greek word diatheke does appear in this literal, now no grammar added translation. For a covenant, diatheke, over dead victims is steadfast, since it is no force at all when the covenant victim liveth. That's phenomenal. That's a phenomenal translation because we ripped out the grammar. We got rid of the funky monks. You know, the monks, they insert all the grammar in there. Whatever they want it to make it sound like, you can put enough grammar in there and you can make it sound like whatever you want. Let's rip out the grammar. There is no grammar in Greek. And let's just literally read it. For a covenant over dead victims is steadfast, since it is no force at all when the covenant victim liveth. Diathemene. The return to Book of the Covenant living could only happen after Yahusha died and paid the death penalty position of Genesis 15. No matter what, it could not function when the covenant victim lived. Yahusha was a covenant victim. He was a victim of Israel's unfaithfulness and a victim of my unfaithfulness and your unfaithfulness. Now, men is often inserted into the text. Verse 17, show me your hands. Who's got men in verse 17? Quite a few of you. It's not in the text. The Greek word for men is aner or anthropos. It's not in the text. So they throw that one in there, which confuses us more. We're talking about the death of the covenant victim. Men or man is not in the text. It's absent. So the language in this text makes it impossible. It makes it impossible to ignore the direct attachment back to Genesis 15. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if there is no Book of the Covenant, Book of the Law paradigm, then why is Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Exodus 19, all the way through Exodus 24:12 and Exodus 32 all explicitly referenced when talking about the work of the Melchizedek? Why in Hebrews are all of the verses that build the whole of the covenant, Book of the Law paradigm right there? It's interesting to know, brother brought it to my attention this week. He talked to me about the Book of Jubilees. And I've read the Book of Jubilees, but not in the paradigm of the Book of the Covenant, Book of the Law. Guess what chapter and verse the Book of Jubilees starts in? Exodus 24, verse 12. The first verse of the added, imposed, not agreed to Book of the Law. I mean, coincidence? Out of all of the verses in Scripture, the very verse that is the first verse of the added, imposed Book of the Law is when the book of Jubilees begins. 24:12. Verse 18, whence not even the first part from blood hath been initiated. Not even the first covenant and the priesthood at Exodus 24, verse 7, was initiated without blood, reminding the people of what had gone on 430 years earlier. That's why the covenant, the book of the covenant, was initiated with blood, Exodus 24, because they needed to be reminded of what had happened 430 years earlier at Genesis chapter 15. So the context of Exodus 19 through 24, of which this speaks, is covenant and priesthood, in particular the book of the covenant, which is mentioned by name in Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, because they were dedicated with blood. Now we get into verse 19. For when Moshe had spoken every precept to all the people according to the Torah, he took the dam, the blood of goats. Now, goats causes a bunch of trouble for people, because if you actually go back to the book of the covenant and the initiation of the blood, you see right there that goats, there wasn't any goats. What are they talking about? Goats doesn't appear in all of the Greek sources of Hebrews. In the ancient Greek sources of Hebrews, and the goats actually appears in brackets. In critical editions of the Greek, like the Nolan Testatum Graece, 27th edition, it does appear in brackets. So you just have to go back to the older Greek to find that goats isn't in there. In the newer Greek, it's been added in. So this causes up this translation problem. Now we can see he took the dam of calves. He took the blood of calves and water and scarlet wool and hyssop. See, I got so excited, I messed up my mic. Sorry. Give me a second here. Okay, I'm back in business. There we go. Getting strangled from behind. He took the dam of goats, doesn't appear in the ancient Greek text like the Novum Testamentum Graece, 27th edition, but we find calves with maim, water, and scarlet wool and hyssop. These verses have caused huge problems. Because people go, well, no, goats. There was no goats. Well, we've cleared that up. You just have to go back to the older Greek. But now we're going to find that Moshe is following the sprinkling procedures of worship that are laid out later in Leviticus 14. You see, what many people don't realize is, just like the Gospels, it looks like everything happened at once when there was the calling of the disciples, but it didn't all happen at once. It's kind of like a telescope. It's a telescoping gospel, and then you connect it all back together. Likewise, Exodus 19 through 24, many of the procedures that the writer of the book of Hebrews is mentioning actually are procedures that are later mentioned, but he's collapsing the telescope to give us a small view. So we see this even in the Torah. He's talking right here about the sprinkling procedures that were later spoken of in Leviticus 14, but here we can see that Moshe followed sprinkling procedures. And it says, well, the book, that, if you go back to Exodus 24, the book, it doesn't say that was sprinkled with blood. The altar was sprinkled with blood, it says that in Exodus 24, but the writer of the book of Hebrews, he's apparently wrong. Well, hang on, think about it. You can look over here. This is heavy. This is a heavy Torah scroll. You try holding a heavy scroll, but you've got a stone altar before you. What would you do with a heavy scroll? You would put it on the altar. And in sprinkling procedures, there's no neat sprinkling here. You're going to be sprinkling the people, the book, the altar. That's what the writer's talking about. There's no neat sprinkling procedure going on there. So yes, he's not incorrect by saying that the book got sprinkled as well. It would have been laid down upon the altar which was sprinkled. Everything got sprinkled. But this has caused huge division, and people say, oh, the writer of the book of Hebrews, he's not quoting the text properly. No, he's giving more insight because he knew what was going on. Does that make sense? So this is, again, these are things that have been brought up over the past decade in the Messianic movement and caused one teacher to throw out the book of Hebrews based upon not slowing down and working through this and think, hang on a minute, yes, it doesn't literally say the book was sprinkled in Exodus 24, but it wasn't a book, it was a huge scroll that would be heavy. You'd place it on the stone altar, and if you look at the sprinkling procedures that were the custom back then that are later laid out in Leviticus 14, they are not neat sprinkling procedures that had hyssop, wool, oil, blood. And that's what the writer of the book of Hebrews is communicating, because he has got the full telescope of what happened, and then he's collapsing that telescope down to speak the narrative to the people that are right before him. So this clears up. We see calves with water and scarlet wool and hyssop. Even Josephus records that the consecrating of the tabernacle, Moshe first took oil, then blood in the sprinkling procedures. And he sprinkled both the scroll and all the people. Verse 20, saying, this is the blood of the covenant, diatheche, which Yahweh has commanded for you. In like manner, later he sprinkled with dam, blood, both the tent of meeting and all the vessels of service. You see in Exodus 29, verse 21, a later telescoping account again, and the sprinkling procedures which were detailed later in Numbers chapter 19, verse 18. Verse 22, and almost all things are by the Torah purged with blood. He's referencing Leviticus 3:2 here. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was therefore necessary that the images of the heavenly things should be purified with these things, although the heavenly objects are from a better sacrifice than these. And this is where one teacher goes off and says, look what the writer of the book of Hebrews is saying. He's saying that the heavens needed to be purified. That's outrageous. The heavens don't need to be purified. That's where Yahuwah resides. Wrong. The heavens do need to be purified because there was a rebellion in the heavens, Ezekiel 28, and this is now what the author is addressing. Sacrifice and altars. Why did the heavens need to be cleansed? And some are stunned. Some are stunned when the writer of the book of Hebrews speaks of such things in chapter 9. The heavenly temple of Yahuwah was defiled by sin before men fell and the world was defiled by sin. That's the reality. The heavenly temple had to be purified. Ezekiel chapter 28. Hebrews 9 verse 22. And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without the shedding of blood is no remission. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. You see, blood, this is the thing, blood was the secret weapon of Yahuwah. And that's what Satan didn't understand. If he understood that, we would never be on this side of redemption. You see, blood was the secret weapon of Yahuwah, because blood is what would conquer sin and Satan. And he kept this hidden from Satan from the foundation of the world. 1 Corinthians 2:7. But we speak the wisdom of Yahuwah in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom, which Yahuwah ordained. He ordained this hidden wisdom, the secret weapon of blood, before the world for your glory, for your glory, for my glory. That's how much he loves us. Which none of the princes of this world, they knew. They couldn't comprehend that. For had they known it, they would not have crucified the Master of glory. Revelation 12:11. And they overcame him, who? The devil, hasatan, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they loved not their lives unto the death. So the heavenly temple and the articles within it had to be purged of sin with blood. Articles like the Ark of the Covenant, Revelation 11. The golden altar, Revelation 8. The menorah, Revelation 1. The table, Hebrews 9. Showbread, Hebrews 9. The golden censer, Hebrews 9. The mercy seat, again, Hebrews 9. These all had to be cleansed. The blood of the red heifer was to be sprinkled, 7 times onto the door of the tabernacle. And what did Yahusha say that he was? He said, I am the door. And he shed his blood 7 times from 7 different places on his body. You see, the red heifer is a picture for us because that was the sacrifice that went outside the gates, Hebrews 13, and carried the burden outside the gates that then cleansed all of those inside the gates. Yet all of those that were associated with its death became defiled. It's amazing. And like that red heifer that had to have its blood sprinkled 7 times, we can see that Yahusha again bled from 7 places, 7 different times. He bled from his face. Luke chapter 22, verse 44. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat, as it were, great drops of blood, falling down to the ground. He bled from his head. John 19, verse 2. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and they put him in a purple robe. He bled from his back. John 19:1. Then Pilate therefore took Yahusha and scourged him. Fourth, he bled from one hand. Yochanan, John 20, verse 27. Then saith he to Thomas, reach hither with thy finger, and behold thy hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but be believing. He bled from his other hand, the 5th place. Yochanan 20, verse 27, again to Thomas. He bled from his one foot, the 6th place. Luke 24, verse 39. Behold my hands and my feet, that it is, I say myself, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see that I have. And then he bled from his other foot. Again, behold my hands and my feet. You see, that's the miracle. That was Yahweh's secret weapon, blood, because that is what would cleanse the heavenly realm. And that's why in the garden he said, do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. He needed to take his blood up into the heavenly realm and cleanse the heavenly realm first. And if anybody had touched him before he had done that work, they would have defiled him. So he ascends to the Father, then he cleanses the heavenly realm. This is what the writer of the book of Hebrews is speaking about. Overcoming and conquering Satan, conquering death. Then he comes and he appears before Thomas. He says, now you can touch me. Now you can touch me, because he cleansed the heavens. His blood is on the Yom Kippur altar in the heavens. So why will we need a Levitical Yom Kippur altar? These are questions that I have. These are questions that I have. It's really reflected in Ezekiel 28 when you see the hasatan. Hasatan was called the Messiah. He was the Messiah. It says that he was the Moshiach Cheruv, the Messiah that covered. Cheruv from cherubim, cheruvim. He was the Moshiach Cheruv, Mesukah. That's what it says in Ezekiel 28. The hasatan, and the metaphor there is the king of Tyre. But we know in Ezekiel 28 that the king of Tyre did not literally walk in the garden with Yahweh. So the king of Tyre is a metaphor for hasatan. And it says that hasatan was the Moshiach Cheruv Mesukah. You can hear a few Hebrew words there. Moshiach, the Messiah, the Cheruv, cherubim, or the one that would cover, like covering the mercy seat, that would mesukah. He would bring all the other angels into the tabernacle, the sukkah of Yahweh. This is what hasatan would do. He would turn around, he would go into the very Shekinah, the glory of Yahweh. He would open up his holy garment, and Yahweh's glory would reflect, his Tifereth would reflect on his stones. He then would come out, face all the heavenly malachim, and he would open up his holy garments, and he would reflect the Shekinah, the glory of Yahweh, to all of the other heavenly malachim, angels, and they would draw close and come into the sukkah, the tabernacle, and worship Yahweh. And he had great pipes, it says. But then iniquity was found in him, and he's like, well, hang on a minute. I'm the only one that gets to go in, and then I'm the one that radiates the glory. Hang on a minute. They're all just seeing me radiating. Whoa! And iniquity was found in him. He wanted to bypass Yahweh, and he wanted to have the glory to himself. And then there he was, as the Mesukah, the Messiah in heaven. He then slayed. He then, as the high priest, who would then go into the holy place, he slaughtered the lamb. But Yahweh's secret weapon of blood. Because you see, Mashiach was slain before the... And if he is a lamb, then he needs to be slaughtered on an altar by a high priest. You see, people don't want to talk about this and teach this because it's scary. Because you're going into undoctrinal waters. But if you are confident in the Ruach HaKodesh and the word of Yahweh and his text and his word that has been made flesh, then you can see this through the reading of the text and the broad spectrum of the whole of the Bible, that Yahusha was slayed by the high priest before the foundation of the world, and that secret weapon of blood, when hasatan thought that he was taking the rebellion and leading the charge, and Yahusha was slain, it was the secret weapon of blood that actually was going to be used to bring in the victory. So when he died on the tree, that was not him being slain from the foundation of the world, was it? That was him overcoming death and conquering death. But the actual sacrifice that overcame sin, the secret weapon of blood, was before Moses, before Abraham, meaning they came to faith the same way that you and I did. There's only ever been one way of redemption. Moshiach, slain from the foundation of the world. And what I'm teaching you now and talking to you now, test it. Tie a string around it, and if it doesn't give Yahusha the glory, but it gives men the glory, then don't trust it. But what I teach, it will always tie a string around it. It will always give Yahusha the glory. That's the test. Test these things. Tie a string around it and see if it leads to an Aaronic priesthood and Levitical genealogy chasing and people worshiping the Torah. Or tie a string around it and see if it leads to covenant righteousness and Yahusha being the high priest. So let's look at those stones that Satan would go in and he would receive the reflection, and then he would go and manifest and shine that Shekinah glory out to the heavenly Malachim. Because by the very stones that he's missing tells us a lot about what was going on. In Genesis, Bereshit, Genesis 49, Jacob was prophesying over each of his 12 sons. The 3 stones that were missing from Lucifer's covering. He had how many stones? He didn't have 12. He had 9 stones. So 3 stones missing. If we look at the 3 stones that are missing, is going to tell us a lot about the war that we are in. They correspond to Gad, Asher, and Issachar. And this prophecy spells out exactly why Satan wasn't given these 3 stones. Why wasn't Satan given these 3 stones in Ezekiel 28? The first stone is Gad. Bereshit, Genesis chapter 49, verse 19. Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at last. You see, Satan will never, ever be an overcomer. And he will not overcome the saints. He will not overcome the saints in the last hours. Satan will never be able to bear anyone's burden. When Yahuwah formed Satan in the beginning of time, he left off this 3rd row of stones. Long before the sons of Jacob were born, he did this. You see, he put limitations on him in Ezekiel 28 from the beginning. This is called what? Restricted authority. He had restricted authority ordained from the beginning. Satan would never be an overcomer. Asher was the 2nd stone. Genesis 49, verse 20. Out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. You see, Satan will never yield anything royal, including the royal seed and the royal Melchizedek priesthood. He could never produce anything royal. That's why he didn't have the stones of Asher. And thirdly, he didn't have the stones of Issachar. Issachar is a strong ass couching down between 2 burdens. Again, he would never bear anyone's burdens, but rather burden man with the weight of sin. The exact opposite. So we can see then why he doesn't have this stone. Isn't that amazing? You see, this is all connected to the writer of the book of Hebrews. It was amazing in the depth and the meat that we have here. And you can easily write that off and say, oh, that's outrageous, the cleansing of the heavens. That's where God dwells. And you can get all holy and righteous and religious. And then look what you miss out on because you don't spend the time tracking everything in the Bible, which is richness and fullness and royal dainties. Verse 24 of Hebrews chapter 9, finishing up here. For Mashiach is not entered into the Kadosh place made with hands, which is an image of the true one, but into the Shamayim, the heavens itself, now to appear in the presence of Yahuwah for us. For he does not need to offer himself often as the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, who enters into the Kadosh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, every year with blood that is not his own. For when he would have to suffer often, for then he would have to suffer often from the foundation of the world. Notice the conceptual point of Yahusha's sacrifice isn't the crucifixion. It's the rebellion in heaven before the world's creation. Yahusha was the sacrifice for sin before the world began, but at the crucifixion he defeated death. Hasatan, as the Moshiach Cheruv Mesucha, the high priest, the Messiah, would bring in and radiate the glory and manifest it to all of the heavenly Malachim with his garment of glory. When he and iniquity was found in him, he slayed the Son, he slayed the Lamb, because sin and iniquity was found in him. But Yahuwah then used that blood, secret weapon, from before the foundation of the world to bring us victory over sin. That's why he said, do not touch me, to the woman. I have to ascend to my Father and cleanse this whole mess that's been happening before Genesis 1:1 ever occurred. This is amazing. This is amazing. And because you and I have received Yahusha into our life and we've began this journey of discipleship, we can see beyond the religious carnal lawlessness, but we can also see beyond the earthly shadow of the messianic Levitical regime, because of that relationship that stirs within us to go deeper and to not say, well, I arrived. Give me my messianic bling, I'm here. I really did get into that for a while. I've got so much messianic bling at home. You have too? I'm going to have to use my tallit as like a tablecloth or something. It's so good, you know? You see, we're able to experience the heavenly reality of Yahusha's priesthood and service today because we hear his voice. And if you haven't experienced spiritual renewal in Yahusha, then how can you know how Yahusha's service in the Melchizedek priesthood is more important than the service of human priests here on earth? You can't. And herein lies the problem. Some are worshiping the Torah or the idea of it instead of experiencing Yahusha. You see, people need to get saved. And they need to get fired up for righteousness and live the holy, righteous life today. It's so easy to worship something and think about, oh, well, yeah, I'll really start doing the Torah down the road when the Jews build a temple. Because then you're not doing anything today. It's intellectual agreement with an idea. It's not living reality today. But the true sacrifice is the inner struggle and sacrificing your sin on the altar of righteousness each and every day. And that is what the author's talking about. What a powerful, powerful chapter. Had to spend that time looking at the translations because you can see translation errors abound, but literal Greek without the grammar clears it up so easily. Questions, comments, anybody at all? You have to put the sound on.
I'd like to thank our brother Derek in North Carolina that gave us that find on the Book of Jubilees, and that's the beauty of this journey we're on. Everybody's involved.
That's amazing. Yeah, Exodus 24:12, the conception point of Jubilees. Isn't that fabulous?
So the Book of Maccabees, they had an illegal priesthood doing a Yom Kippur service. Was that legitimate? Was that a legitimate covering since they weren't supposed to be there to begin with?
Well, you know, the Hasmonean dynasty, at that point, everything becomes so convoluted, and that's why there was the sacking of the Zadokites and them scurrying off with their temple scrolls, the only thing they were allowed to take, off to Qumran. At that point, everything becomes a mess. I mean, it truly is. For 240 years from that point till 70 of the Common Era, our audience, they knew what was going on. They knew that it was a mess. And quite honestly, it hasn't been right ever since. And that is why the light of the secret weapon of the Mashiach's blood from before the foundation of the world is the key to keeping the feasts of Yahuwah. Truly is.
When you were referencing the 3 stones that were missing, Gad, Asher, and Issachar, you gave a verse reference for Gad, Asher, but not for Issachar.
Well, there you go.
Unless I just missed
14. Issachar is a strong ass couching down between 2 burdens.
49, 14.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Bereshit, Genesis 49, verse 14. Excellent, excellent. Well, Abba Yahuwah, we do thank you for your Kadosh, Kadosh word, Abba. We thank you for, Abba, leading us on this journey of righteousness. Abba, for delivering us from the institutionalized system of lawlessness, but also delivering many of us, Abba, from Judaism that was dressed up as a lamb. That, Abba, that we could truly now come to that narrow road of royal Torah. Abba, we thank you that the author of the book of Hebrews has left this testimony for us, Abba, that when he speaks of how to live, he references everything that is the Melchizedek book of the covenant. Genesis 12, 15, Exodus all the way through to 24:12. Abba, we thank you so much that we have been called in this day, in this hour, to proclaim your truth in your royal Torah to the tribes. Amen. Amen.